Late October 2021. A private estate in the Scottish Highlands. Name withheld at the landowner's request. A contract gamekeeper, 31 years old, doing a routine deer cull count, finds a roe deer carcass 80 meters off the main stalking path. Most of the hindquarters are gone. What is left has been dragged under the low branches of a Scots pine and covered, deliberately, with a loose scatter of leaf litter and torn moss. He photographs it before he lets himself think about what he is looking at, because the shape of the thing is already arguing with what he knows to be true. Foxes do not cache. Golden eagles do not cache. A wildcat could not bring down an adult roe deer, let alone drag it under cover. Only one animal on this island is known to hide its kills this way, returning to feed again once the scent has settled. And that animal, according to every official record of British wildlife, has not existed in Scotland for longer than most of the estate's own trees have been standing. He sends the photograph to the estate manager with a 2-word message. Not sure. He never gets a satisfying answer. The carcass is gone within 4 days, scavenged past recognition by whatever comes at night, and the moment closes without ever opening into proof. It would be easy to file the photograph away as one more entry in a long British tradition of half-seen predators. The folklore of phantom cats stretches back further than most people assume, all the way to the 18th century, when the writer William Cobbett described a large, unfamiliar cat climbing into a hollow elm near a ruined abbey in Surrey. What separates this case from that tradition is not the sighting itself. It is the 54 years of specific, documented land history sitting underneath it, and a body of continental research that says, quietly but repeatedly, that the animal in question is exactly the kind of predator capable of going unnoticed for exactly that long. The official record is unambiguous, or at least it presents itself that way. The Eurasian lynx, lynx, is extinct in Britain. Radiocarbon dating of a lynx foamer recovered from Kinsey Cave in the Yorkshire Dales, examined by zoologist David Hetherington and colleagues in 2005, put the animal's death at somewhere between 432 and 580 AD, centuries later than the older assumption that lynx had vanished from Britain in the depths of prehistory. A second specimen, a male lynx skull from Reindeer Cave in Sutherland, in the Scottish Highlands themselves, dates to the Roman era. Conservation organizations campaigning for the animal's return tend to round the number down for the public, citing an extinction around 500 years ago. The bones tell a more precise and more uncomfortable story, closer to 14, even 15 centuries. The cause was not climate. It was deforestation, the collapse of the wild deer that lynx depend on, and sustained human persecution. Scotland had been reduced to roughly 4% woodland cover by the late 18th century, nowhere near enough habitat to sustain an animal that needs continuous forest and a reliable base of prey. Today, 3 charities, Trees for Life, Scotland, The Big Picture, and the Lifescape Project, operate under the banner Lynx to Scotland, working alongside researchers from the University of Exeter and the Vincent Wildlife Trust. Their 2023 study, led by Dr. Sarah Crowley and published in the journal People and Nature, surveyed stakeholders across the Cairngorms National Park and Argyll, and found what its authors called sufficient appetite to keep exploring reintroduction. Not consensus, not a green light, but enough goodwill to justify continuing the conversation. No formal reintroduction has been licensed. NatureScot, the government body that would need to approve any release, has deliberately kept itself outside the advocacy process, citing its future role as the licensing authority. As of this recording, there is no lynx population in Scotland that any institution will put its name to. And when lynx have surfaced in the Highlands in recent memory, the story has consistently been one of captivity rather than wilderness. In January 2025, 4 lynx were illegally released near Kingussie in 2 separate incidents, and every one of them was recaptured within days, described by the experts who examined them as visibly tame, plainly unequipped for a genuinely wild existence. That single, well-documented episode has become the default explanation reached for whenever a lynx claim surfaces in Scotland now. Recent, real, and reassuringly mundane. It is also, as this investigation will show, not a complete explanation for everything currently on the record. The question, then, is not whether a lynx could survive in a highland forest today. The ecological literature has answered that question for decades. Enough deer, enough cover, enough absence of persecution, and the species does perfectly well. The real question is narrower and stranger. It is whether an animal can be simultaneously extinct on paper and alive on the ground. Not because the paperwork is wrong about what happened 500 years ago, but because the paperwork has never been updated to reflect what might be happening now, in places nobody is required to check. To understand why one particular forest keeps surfacing in these conversations, you have to go back to 1972. The estate in question, roughly 9,000 acres of highland ground, its exact location kept out of public records at the current owner's insistence, was, by every account from that era, in poor ecological condition. 2 centuries of high sheep-stocking density had stripped the understory bare. Large sections had been clear-felled for timber during and after the Second World War and replanted, where replanted at all, with dense, biodiversity-poor conifer blocks. Red and roe deer, unmanaged and unpredated, had grazed any natural tree regeneration into the ground almost as fast as it appeared. It was, in the language of one contemporary land survey, degraded moorland forest mosaic with limited recovery potential. An anonymous buyer purchased the land that year and made one decision that, at the time, looked less like conservation strategy and more like neglect, minimal intervention. Sheep were removed. Deer numbers were only lightly managed, mostly for welfare reasons rather than habitat protection. Commercial felling stopped almost entirely. For 54 years, the land was largely left to do whatever it was going to do on its own. What it did was regenerate. Slowly, unevenly, but persistently. Scots pine and birch seed banks, dormant for decades under grazing pressure, began establishing wherever deer browsing eased even slightly. By the early 2000s, aerial surveys of the estate, commissioned privately, never published, showed canopy cover reconnecting across drainage lines that had been open moorland a generation earlier. This is, almost feature for feature, the profile that ecological feasibility work on lynx reintroduction looks for. The Lifescape Project's 2023 ecological assessment of potential lynx habitat in Scotland modeled suitability using exactly this combination of variables. Contiguous forest cover above a critical threshold, high densities of roe deer as the primary prey base, and, critically, low levels of sustained human disturbance. The scale involved is not trivial. GPS telemetry work on lynx home ranges in comparable montane forest, published in the journal PMC in 2021, recorded territories for resident adult males averaging around 150 to 176 square kilometers, with non-territorial floating males roaming stable ranges closer to 1,900 square kilometers when population density was low. A single 9,000-acre estate, a little over 36 square kilometers, is nowhere near large enough to be a self-contained lynx range on its own. What it can be, and what the surrounding land pattern suggests it might be, is one connected link in something bigger, a chain of private highland ground, forestry blocks, and river corridors stitched together loosely enough that a wide-ranging predator could move through several such properties over the course of a single territory, using the best-covered, quietest sections, like this one, as core ground, and passing through thinner cover in between. A single 50-year regeneration story does not, on its own, create a viable lynx range. The species needs many tens of thousands of hectares to support even a handful of resident adults. But it does create something a mapping model cannot easily represent: a corridor. A stretch of connected, quiet, prey-rich forest sitting inside a wider patchwork of highland estates, forestry blocks, and river valleys that, where cover holds, link toward the larger forest networks further east, including the kind of ground the Lynx to Scotland partnership has already identified as suitable core range. A corridor is not a home, but it is exactly the kind of terrain an animal moving through unfamiliar country would use to keep moving without being seen. And there is a mechanism, well documented elsewhere in Britain, by which a lynx could have entered that terrain in the first place. One that has nothing to do with walking across a land bridge that has not existed in 8,000 years, and everything to do with what people did with animals they were no longer allowed to keep. The Dangerous Wild Animals Act came into force in October 1976, 4 years after the estate's new owners stopped grazing sheep. Before that date, private ownership of exotic cats in Britain, lions, pumas, lynx among them, was almost entirely unregulated. Afterward, owners needed a license, secure enclosures, and regular inspection. Wildlife researchers and journalists have pointed to the act for decades as the most plausible origin story for Britain's long-running big cat phenomenon. Rather than surrender or license animals that had become too large, too expensive, or too dangerous to keep, some owners are believed to have quietly released them. A puma named Felicity was captured alive near Glen Affric in 1980. Solid, undisputed proof that at least one large cat lived wild and unnoticed in the Highlands for a period before capture. It is not a large step from that established precedent to the possibility that a lynx, or a small founder handful of lynx, entered the Highland landscape the same way in the same decade, and simply were never recaptured. Here's the part the skeptics get right, and the part the record can't settle. Knowing an animal could have been released is not the same as knowing what it did next. That gap is where the biology becomes useful. Wherever they start from, lynx do not stay put. In the Bavarian Forest and Šumava cross-border reserve straddling Germany and the Czech Republic, a young male lynx named Milan was fitted with a GPS GSM tracking collar as part of a pilot telemetry program, monitoring the population re-established from 17 animals released into the region beginning in the early 1990s. In his first 42 days wearing the collar, Milan covered 261 kilometers, an average of 2 kilometers of ground every single day, threading a star-shaped pattern of nightly hunting forays that sometimes carried him 20 kilometers from his core territory in a single night. A separate genetic study of the Czech lynx population, published in Conservation Genetics in 2021, used microsatellite DNA profiling to identify 4 dispersing males that had traveled more than 98 kilometers beyond the boundary of their home population before being sampled, each one assigned through genetic matching back to a specific source population in Central Europe. And a 2025 telemetry analysis in the Proceedings of the Royal Society, drawing on tracking data from 125 lynx across 8 European populations between 1995 and 2023, found something particularly relevant to a hypothetical Highland founder population. Translocated individuals, lynx placed into unfamiliar landscapes rather than born into established ranges, showed measurably higher rates of long-distance excursion than resident animals, consistent with mate-searching behavior in novel territory. Put plainly, an unfamiliar landscape does not suppress a lynx's movement. It increases it. A separate reintroduction program for the closely related Iberian lynx in Extremadura, Spain, tracked 32 newly released individuals and found exploratory movements sufficient to colonize and connect population centers across a radius of roughly 50 kilometers from the release point. Behavior researchers described as essential to how a small founding group finds and occupies suitable ground it was never physically placed in. Picture it this way. A founder population released at a single point on a map is not a stain that stays where it's dropped. It behaves more like ink released into slow-moving water, spreading outward along whatever channels of connected habitat exist, pooling deepest wherever the current slows down and the conditions are richest. And this estate, by every ecological measure available, is exactly the kind of pool an animal moving through the wider Highland network would eventually settle into. A released or founder animal in an unmapped Highland forest would not sit still. It would explore, and it would keep exploring until it found exactly the kind of connected, prey-rich, low-disturbance ground this estate spent 54 years, quietly becoming. If you've followed the argument this closely, you already understand something most casual viewers of this topic never grasp: that the difference between a myth and a mystery is simply how much of it is checkable. This channel exists for the cases sitting in that gap, the ones science hasn't closed, and folklore hasn't fully claimed either. If that's the kind of investigation you want more of, subscribe. There's another one waiting. Which brings the story back to what is actually on the ground, because movement alone is not evidence. Evidence is what a person can put a hand on. In February 2023, roughly 16 months after the gamekeeper's photograph, a single paw print was cast in drying mud along a burn on the same estate, in a low-traffic section rarely walked by stalking clients. It measured just under 7 centimeters across, larger than any recorded Scottish wildcat print, which typically caches nearer 4 to 5 centimeters, and showed no claw marks at the leading edge of any toe, consistent with a retracted claw feline gait, rather than the splayed, claw-registering print of a fox or dog. A tuft of coarse, pale guard hair, snagged on bark roughly 80 centimeters off the ground, about lynx shoulder height, was recovered later that spring and sent, informally, to a university contact for identification. The sample was consistent with filleted guard hair under microscopic comparison, but was never processed for mitochondrial DNA sequencing, the gold standard test that would confirm species with near certainty. That gap matters, and it is worth explaining rather than glossing over. The genetic assignment techniques used in the Czech dispersal study, comparing a sample's microsatellite profile against reference genotypes from known source populations, work like a fingerprint check against a database. Powerful, precise, but entirely dependent on a lab actually running the comparison. A hair snagged on a fence post on private land, examined informally by a sympathetic contact, never enters that database. It sits in an envelope in a drawer instead of a peer-reviewed paper. A single, low-resolution frame from a trail camera positioned for deer monitoring, timestamped 3:14 a.m. in November 2023, shows a low, long-bodied animal crossing a forest track. Tufted ear silhouettes are arguably visible against the infrared glow, but the resolution is too poor for anyone to stake a claim on it publicly. There is one more layer worth naming, because it is the layer that would actually settle the question, and the layer that has never been properly attempted. Environmental DNA sampling, testing water, soil, or scat for trace genetic material an animal leaves behind, simply by moving through a landscape, has become a standard, relatively inexpensive tool in European large carnivore monitoring, capable of detecting a species' presence from a single degraded strand of shed genetic material long after the animal itself has moved on. It requires almost no specialized fieldwork. A water sample from a burn the animal might have crossed, filtered and refrigerated correctly, processed in a lab within a defined window. No such sampling has ever been formally conducted on this estate. No research institution has requested access. No funding body has attached a study to this specific piece of ground. The single most conclusive test available to modern wildlife science has simply never been pointed at it. None of what has been gathered so far, individually or together, rises to confirmation. None of it, individually or together, is nothing. It is, in the phrase this kind of case always seems to return to, not enough to confirm, not enough to dismiss. So ask the obvious question directly, because the audience watching this is already asking it. If a lynx is really out there, where is the undeniable proof? Why one blurry photograph and not 100 clear ones? The most immediate alternative explanation is the Scottish wildcat, a genuine, native, still-present predator in parts of the Highlands, and one frequently invoked to explain exactly this kind of ambiguous track or blurry frame. It is a reasonable first instinct. It is also a poor fit for the specific behavior recorded here. An adult Scottish wildcat weighs somewhere between 4 and 7 kilograms, roughly the size of a large domestic cat. An adult roe deer can weigh 3 to 4 times that. A wildcat is not physically capable of killing, dragging, and caching a carcass of that size. The behavior the gamekeeper photographed in 2021 falls entirely outside what the species can do, regardless of how the animal that did it was later identified or misidentified in any single frame of trail camera footage. That single point of behavioral evidence does more to rule wildcat in or out than any blurry image could. Start with coverage. The Cairngorms National Park, the most heavily studied wild landscape in Scotland, covers 4,528 square kilometers and still required a dedicated, funded, multi-year academic project just to survey human attitudes toward a lynx that isn't even there yet. Camera trap density on a privately managed estate outside any formal research program is a fraction of that, often a handful of units, positioned for deer counts, not predator monitoring, checked on a schedule of weeks rather than days. An animal actively avoiding humans, moving mostly between dusk and dawn across tens of thousands of hectares of connected but unmonitored ground, can go a very long time between accidental camera triggers. Second, consider classification bias. British institutions require a very specific evidentiary bar before updating a species' official status. Genetically confirmed samples, ideally a breeding population, processed through recognized channels. And anecdotal reports, however numerous, do not clear that bar on their own. This is precisely the skepticism that has surrounded Britain's broader big cat phenomenon for half a century. The government position remains that no confirmed breeding population of any large exotic cat exists in Britain, despite thousands of eyewitness reports and a small number of hard, undisputed captures like Felicity the puma. Third, and most directly, the escaped or released hypothesis is not hypothetical. It is current. In January 2025, 4 lynx were illegally released in 2 separate incidents near the Highland Wildlife Park at Kingussy, not far from the Cairngorms. All 4 were recaptured within days, using trail cameras and box traps. One died on what local weather records confirmed was the coldest night in the area in 15 years. Wildlife experts who examined the recaptured animals described them as visibly tame, clearly accustomed to captivity, unlikely to have survived long unassisted. That distinction matters here. A newly dumped, human-habituated lynx behaves nothing like an animal independently caching a full-grown roe deer carcass under moss and returning to feed on it days later. A level of self-sufficient, undisturbed hunting behavior that points, if anything, toward an animal that has been surviving unassisted for a considerable stretch of time, not one recently abandoned by an owner. Fourth, there is simple decomposition. Highland weather is wet, cold, and full of competing scavengers: foxes, pine martens, carrion crows, buzzards that can strip a cached carcass to bone within days and scatter tracks into meaningless smears within hours of rain. Whatever evidence exists on the ground has a very short shelf life before the landscape itself erases it. Put all 4 factors together: thin coverage, a high bar for official confirmation, a real and recent precedent for exactly the alternative explanation skeptics reach for first, and a climate that destroys evidence almost as fast as it's made. And the absence of overwhelming proof stops looking like proof of absence. It starts looking like exactly what you'd expect if something rare, wary, and genuinely present were doing everything in its power not to be found. Return for a moment to that morning in October 2021. A gamekeeper crouched over a partially eaten deer, phone raised, a photograph he never quite knew what to do with. He was not looking at a folktale. He was standing in the middle of a 54-year experiment nobody had designed as an experiment at all. A landowner who simply stopped intervening. A forest that quietly rebuilt itself into precisely the shape ecological feasibility studies say a returning predator would need. And a species with a well-documented, scientifically measured capacity to travel that far and further once it finds ground worth staying on. It was never officially declared extinct in that forest, because officially, nothing about that forest was ever surveyed closely enough to declare anything at all. The gamekeeper still works the estate. He has not photographed anything like it since, though he checks the same stretch of ground more carefully than he used to, and he has started leaving a trail camera up through the autumn months on his own initiative. Unpaid, unofficial, mounted a little higher on the pine than the rest. Nobody has told him to stop. That is the part worth sitting with after this video ends. Extinction, as it is recorded in Britain, is not usually a live judgment. It is an inherited assumption based on evidence collected once, decades, or centuries ago, rarely revisited unless someone has a specific reason to look again. Absence of proof and proof of absence get treated as the same thing constantly, and almost never are. This one forest did not set out to prove anything. It simply stopped being managed, stopped being watched, and, over 5 decades, became quiet enough, wild enough, connected enough for something the maps say isn't there to move through it without anyone noticing, until a scattering of leaves over a half-eaten deer forced the question into the open. Scotland has hundreds of thousands of hectares of ground under exactly this kind of low-intervention private ownership. Estates nobody surveys, forests nobody counts, glens where the last formal wildlife assessment predates most of the people currently living nearby. If one quietly neglected forest could do this in 54 years, without anyone intending it to, the real question this case leaves behind isn't whether the lynx is out there. It's how many other blank spaces on the official map are doing the exact same thing, in the exact same silence, right now.